A heartbreaking crime of complete and utter betrayal by someone the victim believed she could trust. But this betrayal wasn't the worst part either. The actual murder would be one of the most horrific ever seen. This victim had been set ablaze, but not after she was killed. She was burned alive. The motive for this? Oh, that's going to upset you even more. You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is a very heartbreaking one about a college student who was betrayed and burned alive. And if you are not aware or just need a refresh, this month is Oddtober, which is the strangest cases that I can find, a whole bunch throughout the month. So if you need to catch up, there will be a playlist down below for everything that I've posted this year as well as years past if you haven't seen those either. But this is yet another one of those super strange cases, and there are more to come. So make sure you are subscribed if you're not already, hitting that post notification bell for reminders, and leaving a nice comment and thumbsing up if you would like to as well. And I also want to thank our sponsor, Star Chef 2. Now, Star Chef 2 is actually a cooking and restaurant simulation game with live events where you can actually go on world adventures to search for magic ingredients for your different dishes. And you also get to build your own virtual restaurant, and you can serve over 200 different sorts of recipes and cuisines. They even have a Halloween theme right now where you can go on different spooky adventures to get different ingredients. There's a haunted graveyard, there's trick-or-treating, and they pretty much have a theme for every single holiday, which I love. So if you would like to be a virtual pretend business owner at your own restaurant, then click the link down below and you can download Star Chef 2 for free. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1995 in New York, and Kimberly Antonakos lived in Brooklyn. She was 20 years old. She had been born on November 15th of 1974 and had grown up as an only child. Now, her father was Thomas Antonakos, who was an extremely wealthy and successful businessman. He had been in real estate for a while, but he at this point was running a computer business that sold to big corporations. And so he used his money to really spoil his beloved daughter. He absolutely adored her. Now, he had actually divorced from her mother, Marlene, when she was about 1 year old, and for a while, Kim saw her father on the weekends and would be with her mother full time, and Thomas really treasured that weekend time with her and would always make sure to, be up and at him and making sure that he was making the best out of those small, short weekends that he had. But eventually, her mother did end up moving to Florida, and she remarried, and she gave Kim the option, come with me or stay with your father. And Kim decided to stay in New York where she had grown up, and so she would stay with him for a while. They had a really, really, really close relationship. And after this, Kim actually asked her father not to remarry again until she was out of the house. She said that was really not something that she could handle, was seeing her mother and father get into different relationships, especially if she was still living with him. And her father said okay, he would do anything for Kimberly. But at this point, at 20 years old, Kim was studying business at the College of Staten Island, and she was known to be this very fiery girl, and she was so much fun. She was really someone that you would want to go out and party with all the time, and she would also be someone who had a very generous heart. Even though she came from money, she had money at her disposal. It was not something she kept to herself. She was more than willing to help people out, and all of her friends knew that as well. The only problem was that Kimberly could be a bit naive because of this. She didn't have much experience, of the rough, evil parts of the world, and so her heart was a lot more open than most people's would be. But just about a year prior to what we're going to get into, she had asked her father if she could move into her own apartment. She wanted some freedom, and so her father actually said yes, even though he was very worried about her actual safety of living alone. He said, you know what? We are going to teach you about some responsibility. You can get a part-time job and pay for part of this apartment, and I think it'll be good for you. So basically, they went out together searching. They found an apartment for her, and she moved in shortly after. Her father also bought her a parking garage spot, which was in the basement of a home across the street. And he also bought her a cell phone, which was very hard to come by around this time, as well as a pit bull puppy, because he wanted to make sure that she had the best tools to feel safe and to actually be safe in case anything were to happen. He was very on top of it with that. He knew that she was a single woman. She had boyfriends in her past. She didn't always pick the best kind of boyfriends, and she really wasn't one that wanted somebody at this point. So she would be living alone, which scared her father. Overall, her father just wanted to make sure she could take care of herself. And, she even told Kim, if you want to move back in, that's more than okay with me. If you want to get a job at the family business, that's all right too, if that was what she wanted. Thomas never pressured her into anything, but the option was there. And at this point, she was living this happy, free college life with parties, boys, all amounts of freedom that she didn't have prior. However, those who she surrounded herself with would actually betray her in every way. So on March 1st of 1995, Kim decided to go out partying. She would love to go to these parties mainly for salsa dancing. She loved to go out dancing, and her friend Liz actually did as well. And she went out that night. However, she would never come home. She actually went out the night of February 28th, and then, that she was partying into the morning that people knew about. However, she did not come home the rest of that March 1st. And her coworkers actually began to get worried because she had a shift that day, because she had a part-time job there, and so she didn't show up. They ended up calling her father, Thomas, and saying, she didn't come in today. Is something wrong? Is she sick? And Thomas couldn't get a hold of her either, so he ended up going over to her apartment, where he couldn't find her there either. He started calling her friends, and nobody had seen her since that night prior, so he decided to immediately go to the police department, file a missing persons report, and get things moving. He was one of those really adamant fathers, and so when he, was getting the, we'll have to wait a little bit from the detectives, he went ahead and organized his own search party with her friends and the rest of their family to go out and do it on their own. Kim's 1994 white Honda Accord that she had taken and driven that night was also still gone, as though she had never actually returned to the apartment. It was a brand new car that her father had just gotten her. And so when the NYPD at first was trying to say we have to wait a while, and Thomas was not putting up with it, he actually continued to go to different places in the department to talk to different people to say, something is wrong, we're doing something now, we're not waiting. And eventually he got to a detective who was Detective Phil Trocola, who immediately got this really rough feeling in his gut. He knew something needed to be done now, and he didn't wait, even though that was protocol. That's what everyone else was telling him. He ignored everybody else and said, okay, I'm going to help search for your daughter. And so the investigators found that the day prior, the actual day that she went out drinking, and the next morning, February 28th, she had gone to classes for business administration at the college. She had those classes. She went to them that day. And she later went to work at Amelia's Interiors, where she had a part-time job bookkeeping for them. And by the evening, she was ready to go out on the town, and she had this friend, Liz Pace, who would always go with her. So Liz actually came over to her apartment. They were getting ready together. They were talking. They spent many hours actually doing this. So they didn't actually leave her home until 1 a.m. At this party, like I said, they both loved dancing. They didn't ever really dance with boys. They really just danced with each other, kept to themselves, and then around 4 a.m., they decided they were done. They wanted to go home. So investigators got a hold of this Liz Pace, and she said, yes, that is when we left. It was around 4 a.m., and Kim ended up dropping her off at her neighborhood, which was in Canarsie, which is a neighborhood in Brooklyn, which is only actually a few blocks from Kim's apartment. So Kim dropped Liz off, and Kim said she was going straight home. That's where she should have been. So investigators then went to Kim's home, hoping, to find evidence, and they mainly went to the garage because they wondered if something had happened there between the time of her getting home and when she was supposed to go inside. Now, they hoped to find the car, really, and that maybe something was left behind from the car, or the car itself could be there. However, they did find something. and it was very, very small, lying on the ground. It was a gold seashell earring, just one of them, lying where a car should have been. They took this earring to Liz, and she said, yeah, Kim was wearing it that very night. She had both earrings in. She was saying that all night she had both earrings in, that she would have noticed that. But investigators had no evidence of really what this meant, besides that it could be a possible abduction from her garage once she got home that night. There was no blood, there was no sign of a struggle, but there was not much that could have shown that in the garage other than if there was blood on the floor. So an APB was put out for this 4-door white Honda Accord. It was placed in the NYPD system so that every officer could see it. They were all out searching for it, and they were also searching every area in New York for locations where cars would be taken after they were stolen and where they would be stripped for parts. So this, car thief could get money off of the car without actually selling the full thing. However, none appeared to match Kim's. Thomas ended up calling his lawyers as well as FBI to help him, and it was found that her credit cards had not been used since she disappeared. This did not look like a runaway. At this point, the only identifiers to actually find Kim would be the clothing that she was wearing that Liz had described from that night, but it would also be 2 tattoos. She had one on her back and her leg, and it was an infinity sign with a naked couple laying inside of it, as well as a scorpion, which was her birth sign. Investigators did find, however, that inside of Kim's apartment, she had a landline. She had a cell phone, but she also had a landline. And that night, 65 calls had been made from inside of her apartment. Now, this wasn't crazy because investigators went to search inside of her apartment, and that is where they found people. This is why they didn't immediately go in, overturn everything, start searching like crazy, because there were people living there. Now, Kim did not have roommates. Like I said, she was single. She was living alone, but she was, during this time, hosting a little family. And this was Kim's friend, April, as well as her 23-year-old boyfriend, Joshua Torres, and their 2-year-old son. You see, their apartment was having the floors redone, and they were basically kicked out for a while. They didn't know where else to go. And so Kim generously said, you can stay at my apartment in my spare bedroom. It's not a big deal. So they had been staying there for around 2 weeks. They were still inside the apartment when investigators got there. They were spoken to, and they were saying, we have not heard or seen her either. And they had gone out searching with Thomas to try to find her during this time as well. They appeared to be just as distraught. And Joshua was telling them, I'm actually calling all of her friends, trying to find somebody who knows something, which made sense as to why there were so many calls coming from that apartment. Joshua said that he was always protective over Kim, that she was like a little sister, and that he would basically, if anybody came to the door to pick her up, any boy, he would say not to mess with her, because then they would have to deal with him. After 2 days of searching, Kim's mother, Marlene, was then informed after 2 days, and she flew straight from Florida to New York to help in the search for her daughter. And she actually stayed at Kim's apartment, so they had to kick out this family that was living there so she could stay there. She was then told by a friend of hers to go see a psychic, that possibly they would know what happened to Kim, where she was. And so Marlene, with very little to cling to in this search, decided to go ahead and do so. So she went to a medium named Ellie Crystal and showed her a picture of Kim. And that's when this medium would say that Kim was still alive, but was in grave danger, that she needed to be found right away. She said that she was cold, weak, and dehydrated. Ellie also said she knew that Kim had been kidnapped and tied up. However, what she would say next would frighten everyone, because she would go on to say that she was kidnapped by someone she actually knew. That during this kidnapping, she attempted escape but was caught and overpowered. And then Ellie was saying, I keep seeing the letter J over and over again, and I don't know what that means. She said that she believed this kidnapper was a young male with a first name starting with the letter J. But that's all she could see. Now, with this being literally the only evidence of this possible kidnapping, investigators actually did give this to the public, to the media, and it was suddenly broadcasted everywhere, on the news. The next day on March 4th, a lot of the fire department as well as the police were preoccupied from the search because there was this huge house fire on 86th Avenue, Woodhaven in Queens around 2 a.m. A neighbor had claimed that prior to the fire, a dog had been barking at the house. Her dog was just non-stop barking at this house, and she didn't really see anything. She didn't know what it could be. She knew the house was abandoned normally, and so she really didn't do anything about it until, of course, the investigators were there for the fire, and then she told them. But another neighbor had called in saying, "I see smoke, and this house normally doesn't have anybody in it." Now, the flames were extinguished quickly, and so firefighters and investigators went inside because they did still have to search the home, even though everyone was saying nobody lived there. And so once they got inside, they got down to the basement, and that's when they would find a body. Now, this body had dark hair and appeared to be a woman, and she was completely charred, as well as tied to a chair. This identification was going to be difficult because she was completely unrecognizable. Upon further inspection, it was found that this woman was not just sitting in the chair. She was bound by her legs and her arms to this chair. She was wearing no shoes, her hands were tied behind her back, and this fire was determined to be arson. It only got worse when the coroner was given the body to examine because they found that not only was this woman burned, she was burned alive. There was smoke in her lungs. This meant that somebody had poured accelerant all over the home, including her, and set her on fire. It wasn't hard for investigators to theorize who this was when they heard about it, but no one wanted to believe that this could really be her. It had only been 3 days, and this was the most horrific outcome. The detective, Phil Tricolo, couldn't even bring himself to go look at Thomas to tell this father what had happened to his daughter. However, they needed to because they needed him to identify. They needed dental records to actually identify her because there was really nothing else. He was, giving them pictures saying, "Here, does it look like my daughter?" And they were saying, "Sir, we can't tell from those photos." And that's when he started to realize what had happened. Though not long after this, they were able to uncover her tattoos that were an infinity sign and a scorpion. They now knew what happened to Kim, but they had zero evidence as far as who had done this and why, other than this psychic's telling of the story. Investigators dusted for fingerprints at the crime scene where her body was found, as well as where her abduction was thought to be in that garage, but they didn't find anything. The noise that the neighbor with the dog kept hearing, as well as, the dog barking, meant that Kim was trying to get help, but she was ignored. Now, the owner of this home, who hadn't yet sold the home because it was just sitting there abandoned, had a family member actually come and check in on it every once in a while. And, he would be there to look around, to pick up the mail, to sometimes just hang out there. And when they heard that a fire had occurred there and that a woman was found there, they, of course, came forward to say that it wasn't them, but also that this person who would come and check on the home had been there during the time that Kim would have been there. That he walked around, that he picked up the mail, but he didn't go in the basement. And Kim was so close to rescue, but he didn't even see her. He didn't hear her, and he left. He locked the door behind him. He did notice, however, that one set of keys they normally kept inside was missing. This entire scene was exactly what this medium had described. So the parents decided to go back to her to get more information to see if she could figure anything else out. And so Ellie, along with the parents and investigators, were all sitting down. That is when she said she actually saw 4 people involved in this murder. She said she kept seeing that letter J. And no one realized how true everything that she was saying was. And it was hard for many, especially investigators, to believe a psychic. Thomas then began offering a $10,000 reward for information on her murder, and what I didn't tell you was that when Thomas came home from filing that missing persons report, he had gone to his answering machine that was blinking. Now, he had gotten a call twice, and a message had been left, but these messages were silent. Investigators theorized that this could either be Kim trying to contact him or possibly a ransom call. However, nobody ever called back and nobody knew what they were trying to say or if this was just some wrong number. Now, some began to say that this was actually Thomas's fault, that he was this wealthy businessman and that he worked for the mob. This was because he had a business on a block that was known to be a mob leader's block. This was John Gotti, and it was said that if you were on this block, you had to run around with John Gotti, and that meant that you could not wrong him or you would be in trouble. And many theorized maybe Thomas was in trouble with Gotti and he took it out on his daughter. However, investigators knew that most of the time mobs don't go after the children. They go right after the person that they're dealing with. So they would have gone after Tom, they would have broken his legs, they would have shot him. They would have attacked him before ever going after his daughter. And he was not injured. There was also no proof that he was actually working with this mob. It was also found that 3 days since she vanished, the same day her body would actually be found, Kim's car was found as well. Residents noticed it had been parked there for around 2 days, 3 days. The last few days is what they were saying. However, it was not connected to Kim during this time because her car was not officially reported stolen. Now, I know that APB was sent out, but it wasn't reported stolen. They were only looking for it. And so it was not connected to Kim, and they did not find it for a very long time. When it was located, though, in the trunk, was that gold seashell earring that matched the one in the garage. Kim had been in the trunk. There were hairs and a fingerprint was also located. Then 6 long months later of not knowing what happened to Kim, this was September 6th of 1995, a witness came forward. This was a male and a female, and they claimed that their friend had been bragging about the murder of Kim Antonakos. Their friend's name? Joshua Torres. Now, why does this name sound familiar to you? Well, if you don't remember, it's because that is the name of the husband of the couple living in Kim's apartment. You see, when Thomas went to Kim's apartment to search for that very first time, he knew that she had friends staying there, but he had never officially met them. So he was meeting them for the first time. And Joshua kept saying, I'm calling Kim's friends, and the only one who hasn't picked up is one of Kim's ex-boyfriends named Psycho. That was his nickname, obviously, but he was a pale blonde man that was said to be Russian, and Kim was afraid of him, according to Joshua. And Joshua said he had seen a group of Russians driving down the street the night that Kim disappeared. So when investigators went to Kim's apartment during this time, Joshua told them the same thing. He also offered to take them to places where car thieves would take their cars for those spare parts that maybe they didn't know about, because Joshua was involved in illegal activity sometimes, but we'll get into that in a moment, because Thomas then asked Joshua for Kim's spare keys and went to the garage. They all went down together. Thomas was the one who actually found the earring and gave it to investigators, but before he could, Joshua had gone down to this garage with him and actually ran over and picked up that earring. After this, Joshua kind of disappeared for a while, but Thomas took Psycho's photo that he had been given, and he ended up going down to a police department nearby where Psycho lived, and he was asking, do you guys know who this is? If he could be involved in a murder. And those officers were saying that he was a 23-year-old who was out on bail for statutory rape. So his home was where Thomas went next. And it didn't appear as though he was home. Most of the people around him, living around him, did not know where he actually was or much about him at all. But Detective Tricrola actually found Psycho, picked him up, and brought him in for questioning. However, after that, they did not believe that he actually had anything to do with the murder. And he did have a tattoo of the name Kim on his leg, and they were saying, that makes you look very suspicious. Did you do this while you two were together? And he was saying, actually, it stands for Kick It Mike, because he had a friend, Mike, who had kicked his drug habit. So investigators kind of put Psycho on the back burner, and they went back to Kim's apartment, and they were looking at the calls that had been made from her landline, and they found that most of those calls weren't to her friends, but to different random women. There was also a call that had been made before Kim was even kidnapped, when she would have been out that night partying. They then began to look at Joshua's pager because most people had pagers during this time instead of cell phones. Joshua had this pager, and that night he had gotten a message from Kim's apartment. He said, he had the pager the whole night. However, he also said he was at the apartment the whole night. So they were saying, why would you page yourself inside of the apartment? That just doesn't make sense. So the news broadcasts were happening, about what they believed had happened to Kim and trying to find her abductors and killers. And at this point is when Joshua and one of his friends named Julio would end up leaving to go and search for her. Now, they refused to let anybody go with them. And at this point, Thomas said he had also asked Joshua to go with him to church. He knew that Joshua was Catholic. So he said, will you please come to church with me to pray for Kim and, to finding her killer? And he refused to do so. But Joshua and this Julio and a lot of their other friends had gone to Kim's funeral. Now, one thing to note is that Joshua actually didn't have a job. He didn't have any money on his own. He lived off of his wife, April, and stayed home to take care of the son. But Joshua was then spoken to again because they were beginning to think that he was very suspicious. And so he was told at this point, we don't think Psycho is a suspect. And that is when Joshua was saying, oh, I agree. My new theory is that it was done by 3 men who threw her to the ground and put her in the trunk. He said this must have been a professional kidnapping gone wrong. Now, Joshua did have quite a few friends around him, and so instead of going after Joshua right away because they figured he would be the last to break, they began bringing in his friends. At first, they brought in this Julio, which his last name was Negron. So Julio Negron was questioned first, and it turned out Julio actually once dated Kim, absolutely loved her, and wanted to commit to her. However, she wasn't interested in committing, so they did break up. He had met her through Joshua and April. After a while, Julio confessed to the murder. However, only that he knew about the planning, not the execution. He then implicated Joshua Torres. So at that point, Joshua Torres was officially brought in, and he was saying, I had nothing to do with this. But his wife, April, actually didn't necessarily believe him. You see, what I didn't tell you was that the day the medium's information was released and things started going on to the news, there was movement in Kim's apartment because the wife of the couple living in her home said that Joshua and his friends were watching this news on the TV and they suddenly got up and left. One of those friends was a 19-year-old Nicholas Liberetti who went by Little J. Now, they left abruptly and didn't really tell her where they were going. And that was the same day her body would be found charred. So this Nicholas Libretti was found and questioned, and he, like Julio, confessed without much push at all. Now these 3 men, Julio, Nicholas, and Joshua, meant that there was not the 4 men like this medium was saying. Was she wrong? Or was there another man involved? Well, it turned out there was another friend of this group named Jose Negron. Now, Julio and Jose both had the last name of Negron, but they were not related in any way. They just happened to be friends. But this meant that there were 4 in total, or there could have been. 4 men who all knew Joshua, and through Joshua knew the murder victim, and also all helped to search for her during those 4 days, but might have actually committed the crime themselves. So what was the motive for all of that? Well, investigators didn't know that yet, but they did know that these men were trouble. And each had a criminal record for some minor and harsh offenses, but they were never in jail for long enough to make them stop committing crimes or think further about, their life decisions. In fact, this Nicholas was out on bail during the night of the kidnapping for breaking into a home with a family inside. He and some of his friends, his other friends, I guess, put a gun in a mother's mouth and was basically threatening to kill her if she didn't tell him where everything was. And when her little child started crying, she had a 4-year-old son, Nicholas ended up pointing the gun at this child. Now, 2 officers actually saw this occurring and they were arrested for this. They were doing it bright and early in the morning, and after all of this, Nicholas got $1,000 bail instead of the 25 years that he could have gotten. because his mother bought him a very expensive and good lawyer. Now, Joshua was out on probation during this time as well, and these men were known to have a kidnapping for hire business, which was mainly for drug families to be able to kidnap one another to get back at one another. But from these confessions, the investigators were trying to piece together what had really occurred. You see, they were told that Kim had been watched that night, that she was going out to the parties, and that is when Nicholas would get a call from a KQ, which stood for King Quality, which was actually Joshua's nickname. So Joshua had called Nicholas and told him that Kim was out that night, and that if they were going to go through with their plan, they should do it then. This plan was made by KQ, or Joshua, as well as Julio, Jose, and Nicholas. A plan to kidnap their sweet friend. It all started when Joshua had actually drove by an expensive car for sale that he wanted but didn't have the money for because he didn't have a job. He then began to say that his friend Kim had money, that if they kidnapped her and held her for ransom, they'd never have to worry about money again. And the idea just spiraled from there. You see, Joshua was known to be a bad man. At just 17 years old, he was called a chicken hawk, which is basically where he would abduct children and sell them to predators in the city for a large cost. He was caught for this, but it was called promoting sex work, and he only got 5 years probation. During this probation, he was also arrested for the sexual assault and imprisonment of an underage girl, and he spent 60 days in jail for that. The next year, he got 18 months for carrying a gun. This was 2 years before Kim's murder, and it obviously hadn't gotten any better. Joshua was also said to practice witchcraft, where he would sacrifice animals. Now, the police actually had a name for this friend group, and boys like it in the area. They were all called mutts because they always evaded the harshest punishment, even for horrific crimes, and so they were having to bring them back in over and over and over again, and they said that they were dangerous together, and basically if they were cornered, it was a very horrific situation for everybody because they would go crazy. Now, these crimes, it appeared, had escalated to murder. They wondered, though, if April had anything to do with this, Joshua's wife, or if she knew anything. So they brought her down to the station to tell her in person that Kim was dead. They wanted to see her reaction, and she was actually very angry at this, more than upset. She then asked Joshua to come be in the room with her. And April told investigators that Kim was admired by a lot of men, especially when she would go out dancing. That the night of her disappearance, they were both in bed, they were both home the whole time at Kim's apartment when Kim's landline started ringing, but they just let the answering machine get it because they were already in bed. The next morning, she said she knew Kim hadn't come home that night because her bed was still made. And so April said, she left for work like regular and didn't know what happened until now. Joshua then used April as his alibi, claiming that he was home with her all night, he never left, and he woke up after her the next morning after she had already gone to work. But it was told to investigators that it was Jose and Nicholas who actually took Joshua's pager to let him know how the plan was, panning out, and they followed Kim to her party before following her back to the garage where they attacked her inside, and what they had on them was duct tape and a handgun. So when Kim drove up, parked in the garage, before she could shut the door, they ran inside and tried to pin her down. But she was a fighter, and she was fighting back hard. They claimed that she kicked them, she scratched them, she was fighting them off so hard it was breaking her fingernails. But then her face was covered with duct tape. Her mouth, her eyes, which actually covered her ears as well, her legs and her hands were bound, and she was thrown into this trunk. She was still screaming at this point, so Nicholas turned up the radio. He then drove her car out of the garage, closed the garage door so it didn't look like anything happened, and Jose went back to their car and followed in it. They believed that Kim was kicking the trunk during this time with her, she had these huge black boots on. She was trying to use it to get out of this trunk, but she wasn't successful, and she did drop the gold shell earring while she was doing so, which is why it was found in the trunk. But at this point, Kim actually didn't see her attackers. I don't know why. This was not really specified. I don't know if they were wearing masks, if everything was dark, but Kim was said not to know who these people were. Now, they ended up going to an abandoned home that Jose had broken into, gotten the keys for prior, and they took Kim inside. She was immediately tied to the chair in the basement, which was next to, a pole in the basement that was tied to that so she couldn't get out of it. And when they took the tape off of her mouth, she said, "Why are you doing this?" And they ended up telling her, "Because your father Thomas owes us money." She said, "I know that's not true. He doesn't owe you anything." And that is when they filled her mouth with gauze and they put the duct tape back over. For the next 3 days, this is where she was kept, with no food, no water, and the freezing cold temperatures of New York in the basement. And she also had no idea why this was occurring. Meanwhile, these men were taking her car to a different street, wiping it down to get all of the evidence off, and they also tossed her purse out the window after getting her phone and wallet. They then went to a payphone and called KQ, or Joshua, and said, "The party's over," which was the code for the plan had worked. KQ then went to another payphone and called Kim's father, but he didn't speak to him as Joshua. He began playing a recording that he had, talked into and then sped up so it would cover his voice, and it said, "Hugged your daughter lately? $75,000, your money or your daughter." But as you know, when Thomas checked the messages, there was no message. That could not be heard. And it turned out that Joshua had played the recording too soon, and so he even tried it again because when, he stopped the recording, put the receiver to his ear, he was not hearing anything from Thomas. So he called him again to do the same thing, and once again he recorded it during the wrong time period and nothing was actually recorded. Meanwhile, though, Kim was in this house slowly suffering from hypothermia. She lost all of her senses. She could barely talk, she could not see, she could barely hear, and now she was freezing cold. She was extremely dehydrated, hungry, and she could really barely breathe through all of the tape. Her body began to look as though she was deceased. However, at this point, she was slipping into a coma and clinging to life. She was still alive. But her kidnappers did not go and check on her. Instead, they were getting angry because Thomas was not responding to the ransom they had sent. However, they were too dumb to realize that he didn't even get the message. They also were around Thomas during this time, pretending to search for his daughter that they had abducted, and they didn't ever hear him talking about a ransom, which should have been a sign, maybe he didn't get the message, but instead they just got angry. Now it was Julio who was supposed to be taking care of Kim, giving her food and water and checking on her during this time to make sure she stayed alive enough for them to get the ransom money. But he wanted nothing to do with it. He didn't want to be caught at the house, so he just didn't go. Now, investigators believed at this point that Julio actually wasn't involved in any of it. He specifically placed himself outside of doing anything and just knew about the planning. But he also didn't do anything to stop it. Now, Joshua and Jose said at this point they were planning to let Kim go. Since the ransom wasn't being paid, they were just going to let her go. She hadn't seen their faces. They were going to untie her, put her in the trunk, and then drop her off in a random park and speed away. However, they got to the home, they went to the basement, and they found her not breathing, or so they believed. It was really that she would have been barely breathing with a pulse that would be undetectable, but she could have survived. She was frozen to the chair, and so with that, they believed they had killed her. And so they were going to burn the house down of evidence anyway, but now they were going to do it with her inside. Nicholas and Joshua were the ones who actually took the gasoline cans to the basement, and Joshua began talking to Kim. He said, "Sorry it has to end this way, but life sucks," and then kissed her on the forehead before dousing her in gasoline. They then set an alive but comatose 20-year-old friend on fire. They threw a fridge at the top of the stairs so it would make it hard for investigators to get down there to put out the fire, to find, what they had done. But after this, they called Thomas minutes after killing his daughter and said, "Where was that place that you wanted us to search for the car? We can go now." But they didn't do that. They went and they covered up the crime further. When Nicholas Libretti had confessed, he had asked if he would get the $10,000 reward now that he came forward. Now, Joshua and Nicholas were being charged with kidnapping, murder, arson, and robbery. Julio, of course, wasn't believed to be an immediate threat and wasn't thought to actually have been involved, and so they were keeping him in a place where they could basically use him for testimony, but they didn't know as far as charging what they were going to do with him yet. However, where was this fourth guy, Jose Negron? He had never been questioned. Well, that was because he was already dead. You see, on June 23rd, 3 months after Kim's murder and 3 months prior to these men being brought in and questioned, he had been shot dead in the street. Jose had been walking down the street in Queens, holding his stepson, walking with his girlfriend, when suddenly he just crumpled on the ground on top of the son. Someone had come up behind him and killed him instantly, and his girlfriend checked for a pulse and then had to pull out her son from underneath him, and thankfully he was okay but traumatized. It was theorized that Jose wanted to go to the police about what had occurred, but Joshua killed him to keep him quiet. His murder still remains unsolved, and although there are theories, you'll see that there was nobody charged for it. It was also said that Jose was one who recorded some of their planning of the murder, and that would put him in a better position if they were to get caught, that he wasn't as involved as some of the others. Many people around Joshua had also heard Joshua saying that he wanted to be the last one standing. But by the time that they were actually questioned for the murder, his wife April had kicked him out of the house that they were staying in, as well as her and their son's life altogether. The trial for Joshua Torres had Kim's family outside of the Supreme Court begging for a conviction. The DA said that this murder was the most savage and brutal crime ever to be committed in Queens, that it cries for the maximum penalty, and that they should never let the defendant walk the streets. The judge of this case said it was especially heinous and cries for the death penalty. Joshua had finally confessed to helping to kidnap Kim, but said he did not kill her, and he pled not guilty. Now, the prosecution was brutal. They said that Joshua killed Kim because he was a murderer and a moron. But the defense said that Joshua played no part in this actual crime, that he was framed by Julio because Julio was the one testifying against him in order to get a smaller sentence. Now, Joshua had been told that he had passed the lie detector test. So his lawyer, who had been told by Joshua that this had occurred, confidently went up to a detective who was testifying at this trial. And they said, tell us about the lie detector test that Joshua passed. Well, this detective ended up saying, we never told Joshua that he passed. We just let him go at that point. But really, he failed. Now, Joshua's ex-girlfriend, who was a girlfriend he had after April kicked him out of the house, she testified against him as well. She said that Joshua had come to her and confessed to the murder, and then he beat her up to keep her quiet about it. She said after this, she kicked him out. She wanted nothing to do with him. And she actually called April and said, can you make him come get his stuff? Because, I want him out. This woman feared for her 4 children that she had. And days later, Joshua actually came, kicked down her door, stormed inside, and punched her in the face. He wanted a motorcycle that she had that was legally hers that he thought was his own. But when she tried to run to a car to get to the police, he basically reached into the car, grabbed her by her hair, and began threatening her. He said if she told, he would be tied up in the garage and burned too. So during this time of all this happening, she eventually did get to an officer and told him that her boyfriend was doing this to her, but also that he had confessed to burning a woman to death. And she was saying, do you know anything about a girl who was burned that my ex might have just confessed to? And he actually didn't. But he said, you know what, come down to the police department because I want to ask the other detectives if they know anything about this. So she did, and that's when she found a detective who was like, yes, this is Kim Antonakos. Now, this woman also said that Joshua had confessed to killing Jose. And it was actually found that Jose's girlfriend's mother's home was right next to that abandoned house where Kim was found. This is how Jose found this abandoned home and how everything eventually came together for this horrific murder. Now, in order to actually find Joshua to question him about all of this, they had to use his ex-girlfriend's motorcycle to bring him in and out of hiding. His ex called him and said, "Look, you can have the motorcycle if you leave me alone. Meet me here." And instead, he was met by investigators who brought him down to the station. Now, this woman had to be put in protective custody through the trial after one of Joshua's friends attacked her for speaking out. This was the star witness at the trial. However, while she was in protective custody, she was caught drug smuggling and claimed that she was forced to because drug smugglers were holding her children hostage, that they didn't want her to testify against Joshua and they made her do this. Now, her children were found to be with a babysitter, completely okay, and it made her statement seem incredibly unreliable. Julio would become the next star witness, and when he heard that Joshua was actually trying to frame him for the murder, he came into the police department right away. He did not flee, he did not try to run. He told them the entire plan, what really went down. And then he testified that same exact thing in court, his story never changing. So after 9 hours of deliberation, Joshua Torres was found guilty of 6 counts of abduction and murder. However, he was found not guilty of the murder of Jose due to lack of evidence. Joshua stood up and told the court that he was sorry to Kim's family, but he didn't kill Kim. Precious jewel he loved like a sister. The judge absolutely hated this and sentenced him to the maximum sentence, which at this time was 58 years in prison because the death penalty had not been reinstated in New York, which is why, the death sentence was not even brought up, which is what a lot of people in this case wanted. Joshua was actually shocked at the fact that he wasn't free, but he did not show much emotion as far as, tears. Now, Nicholas Libretti was also found guilty and also sentenced to 58 years, and Julio has been sentenced to 2 to 6 years in prison for, his part not stopping it. Because, like I told you, investigators, really didn't think that he would have committed any crimes. But Thomas, Kim's father, said this was the day he had been waiting for, that it was bittersweet but had to be done, that he would have paid any amount of money to get his daughter back, but he really did not get that message. And then he went to her grave that day that they were convicted, and he told her the good news. He said that it was her birthday and this was his present to her. He does blame himself though for not having her live with him longer, and that her goodness was her weakness. That is just such a heartbreaking statement, and I do want to say it is wonderful to be naive, to be innocent in a world that is so hardened. But it's also the most heartbreaking that those are the ones that are taking advantage of the most. Now, Nicholas was actually attacked in prison for, holding the gun to that little boy's head. Many people were not happy with this, and he died in prison 2 years later of AIDS. Now, Julio, of course, has been released, and Joshua will be released in 2053. But in 2005, Kim's father actually died of cancer, and many say it was actually from heartbreak, that he really just had nothing to live for after Kim died. But do you think these confessions are what really happened to Kim? Did anybody else know about it? Was there more to the story? It's just so sad to me that there were so many people in this case that could have intervened. Not only just like these 4 men saying maybe we shouldn't do this, but also the neighbor whose dog went crazy that entire day, that something was in that house, the owner that had stopped by the home and was actually inside, and who knows how many more who were involved or knew something or heard something that was a little weird and just let it go. It's why it's so important to not just become part of the bystander effect and let things happen. If you see something suspicious, that is your gut telling you something is wrong. Always trust your gut. Even if you are, the paranoid person that calls the police and it ends up being nothing, you could save a life in the end. And that, I think, is worth it. The fact, though, that they didn't properly even send the ransom call, they never heard Thomas talking about it. They knew how much Thomas loved his daughter. He would have paid if he got that message. That could have been a chance that Kim could have been saved if, she would have gotten the ransom before she went to this comatose. I just don't know, why did they not care more about the money if money was their goal? Was there another goal here? Did Julio want revenge on his ex-girlfriend? Did one of the other men have relations with her and get angry when she rejected them? Did Kim know a secret that they didn't want her to know? There's so many possibilities. But it almost seems to me that these men were just morons. as the judge called them, and didn't really know what the heck they were doing. But they sure thought they did. Also, do you think they were really going to release her before they found her comatose, which they believed that she was dead because of? Do you think she was really going to be able to go free that day? Or was that just something they said to make it look like they didn't plan on killing her? They actually believed that she was dead. Such a heartbreaking, unnecessary, brutal case. And poor Kim, she never did anything. She thought that she could trust these people to be in her life. She gave them a home. And they murdered her for it. But remember, there is an entire playlist for Oddtober down below. I also have merch if you guys want it, and I will have that linked as well. All of the proceeds, excluding the tote bags, will be going to a kidnapping survivors project to further help the healing of other survivors. Also, download Star Chef 2 if you are interested in that below for free. Okay, so don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.